All right, Wendy, I am excited to have this conversation today, and thank you for bearing with a few of the technical difficulties up front. So I do want to start with how you got your big break, right? You started at KING TV in Seattle as a reporter and
Mhm,
then an anchor. And
mhm.
I, on the show, always love to find out a little bit of, how did someone get here? So tell us your backstory of how you became a reporter and then anchor in the Seattle area.
Well, it really was not a profession that ever would have occurred to me because there weren't any Asians on television growing up. There weren't any women growing up, but um, they started to hire women, and they had hired blacks at the local TV stations, and then they hired one Japanese American woman named Barbara Tanabe, and when she would come on the TV, because it was the first time we had ever seen an Asian on local television. My dad would go, "Everybody come here, Barbara's on TV." And we would all go running in and watch her and get all excited. Someone knew her and asked her, Barbara, if I could come down and watch her one day, one morning. And I did, and went into that newsroom and very quickly knew that that was where I belonged. That was really, I could feel it in my gut that that was what I wanted to do.
Well,
And then
that's
I had to work my way into a job. I started as a secretary, and then ended up in San Francisco. And yeah, it's been great.
That's amazing, and it's a shame that that had to be the case. You strike me as a person with only knowing you enough to be dangerous that you are one of those people like, yep, doesn't matter that there are no women, doesn't matter that there are no Asians. I will be the second, and I am going to follow in these footsteps, and I'm going to shake things up. So I love that that's the path. Related, one of the things that I would love to know is you're in a unique position in the fact that you went on to be an award-winning primetime news anchor for 40 years. You must have started when you were 5 years old.
Yes, I
Let's
did. Yeah.
talk about some of the biggest changes you saw over the years beyond some of the obvious things.
Well, I think that most of the changes are obvious, right?
That's fair.
And it's the changes in technology that have driven what we're seeing in media. And the biggest change and the most troubling one is that we can't agree on what the truth is anymore.
Yep, that's a big one.
That, yeah, that could we could go for an hour on that. So I think people are pretty much aware of that. I mean, the fact that we've become so siloed, and I mean, I I started so far back in the day that the first big challenge was cable, and then we had hundreds of competitors, and then it was like the internet, and that opened up, the information highway or whatever they called it way back then. And then it was a phone and streaming. And now it's just blowing up beyond that. So that when young people, uh, ask me for advice, or if someone says, "So, I have a young person, can you give them any advice in going in the media?" I go, "You know what? I don't know that my advice is worthwhile anymore because it's just changed too much. It really
Yep.
has changed." But anyway, it's technology changing it. And the fact that it's changed the way we see the truth is troublesome.
It is troublesome. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question that I didn't have in the list, but I always am interested as to where the newsmakers get their news. And I know you've been retired for a few years now, but clearly I'm sure you still pay close attention. Is there any particular source or any particular set of social media channels like Blue Sky or whatever that you pay attention to that gives Wendy Tokuda her daily news or weekly news?
Well, I still read newspapers. I get them online. It's really an affliction. I still read the news like it's my job. Um,
I'm
and I
guessing
think
it's pretty hard to shut that off after 40 years, right?
you just don't, no, you don't. And I think it's because it really tapped into something I really love, which is I have a lot of curiosity about what's going on. And I read the legacy newspapers. Um, I read now a lot of things on Substack, you know, um, and I listen to a lot of podcasts. And and watch some television. I mean, I think the thing that really troubles me is I wish people would know the difference between news and editorializing or talk shows, but I don't think they do. You know, they don't. And even if they understood that small difference, it would make a big difference. But anyway, yeah. So I read, New York Times, Washington Post, local papers every morning.
Well, they're still critical, and I think that I've heard from a few of the guests that have been on, they also are newspaper readers. And while it does feel antiquated, there is still a rigid process around making sure that it's truth, making sure it's clear between
Yeah,
the editorial, and
there's a serious discipline that
there's a
that
serious
um,
discipline.
yeah, that I was trained to respect, and that I don't let go of. That I don't let go of.
Well, and nor should you ever, and we need more of that. I do want to shift gears a little bit, and this
Sure.
is starting to lean into the societal good that we will talk much more about as we go forward. But I was fascinated by this, and this will also set us up for a different question. You and your husband wrote a couple of children's books. I think your daughter is actually a children's book writer as well. Tell us
Yeah.
what inspired you to head down this path.
It was a true story that happened right in front of our eyes or in the newsroom. My ex-husband, Richard Hall, and I were both we met in the newsroom. He was a producer and I was anchoring. And the whale, this whale, Humphrey, got lost and swam all the way up the Sacramento River. And every day we would tell our 5-year-old what the whale was doing. Or she wasn't even 5 then. And I realized if this whale survives, because I could just tell by her reactions, it would make a great book. And he did. And so we wrote that up into a children's book. And then actually rewrote another one. And then I wrote a third one when I was in Los Angeles. And all of them based on stories, true stories that I could see, that we could see, would be interesting for kids.
Well, it's very cool that you had a real life inspiration because I don't know how many children's books actually have real life inspiration. So knowing that now makes me interested, and I want to go do a little research on what did you say the whale's name was?
Humphrey.
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 I want to learn more about
Yeah,
Humphrey swimming up the Sacramento River.
yeah, it's still in print. It's still, which blows my mind, but there it is. Yeah, the kids are
Oh.
still reading it.
I mean, it's a great story, and great stories are timeless, right? But speaking of books,
Yeah.
I know that you confirmed this, so it's not a rumor anymore, but you're writing a book about a much more serious topic. And
Hmm.
you did tell me it was okay to talk about this, but it is about the Japanese internment camps during World War II.
Hmm.
Can you share a little bit about your new project?
Yeah. So what happened was when my mom had Alzheimer's, I was in charge of going through her papers, which is a very sad thing to have to do. But my mom was a gifted writer. She was a real storyteller. Not so much published because she had 5 kids, one after the other, and we kind of blew that up. But she, I came across this file, um, and it had all these letters in it, stamped, censored, enemy, detained enemy alien, um, internee of war, and addressed to her in either in Minidoka or in Puyallup, the assembly center, and then the internment camp where she was incarcerated. And I realized she had saved these, from wartime. And I kept going through the files, and she had saved a lot of other papers. And then I found her journals. She had written journals, yeah, not through the entire 4 years, but for about 2 years worth of journals, maybe a little more than 2 years worth of journals. Um, so which gave me, I was able to walk in her footsteps, truly. And this is her, her writing her intimate, real, authentic thoughts. I mean, she's not holding, it's her journal. So although I could tell that she knew that what was happening was historic, And she also knew it was wrong because some of the things she chose to write about or mention um, were real indications of that. And a couple of her friends she was in her last year at the University of Washington when she was jerked out of school. And so she didn't, she was literally one semester away from graduating, but she never got to graduate. And, but a couple of her classmates, one of them, her romantic interest, um, was her romantic interest, and then his roommate, they were buddies of hers, and they were real active with the Quakers and were resistors early on. And Gordon Hirabayashi became famous because he was one of the few Japanese to challenge the incarceration in court. And he lost uh, during the war, but then that case was reopened later on with new evidence, and they were able to set aside the laws that allowed the incarceration. But back to my mom, um, I could see, I realized that these papers were were historic, you know? Um, and I also, I just felt like she never got to tell her story. I could tell that she really wanted to tell the story herself. And because she had transcribed some of the journals, and they were typewritten. The others, the big problem with it was the others were written in her god awful handwriting. And it took a real long time just to transcribe them, and I could tell even she couldn't read some of the writing because when the ones she did transcribe, she'd go da 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 illegible, and then so. Um, but I felt like I owed it to her to tell her story. And then I started to really examine the effect that it had on me and my siblings, because I was born, she had 5 kids, all within, my eldest brother was born in camp. My second brother was born a year after they got out. I was born in 1950, so within 4 years, um, after she walked out of the gates. And think about what they went through and then how that would transfer to us, right? So I'm reading this there's one document she had saved, and it said, helpful hints when you leave the relocation center. And it was handed out to her when she left Minidoka the first time to get work. And then she went out and my parents met in Minidoka. They met in the camp. And then my dad went to Chicago later. She went to Chicago. They got married there. She actually came back to Minidoka to have her baby. But she saved this one document for when she left. And it was like, it's hard out there. It's wartime. But here's a little advice that we think will help make your adjustment easier. And the advice included, do not speak Japanese in public. Don't gather in groups in public. Don't frequent taverns, or at that time it was honky tonks, and taverns are places that might reflect badly on other Japanese. And somebody there might get drunk and get really angry, lose his head, and it could get dangerous. And some people are going to be hard, it will be hard for them to accept the fact that you are a citizen. Both my parents, of course, were citizens. But keep in mind, that your goal is to find a place in this land of freedom, and you have that right. And so it was all written with the best of intentions. But I realized that, and the other one was, always remember that you are representing everybody else who's leaving the internment camp. So make sure that you make a good impression on everybody and you're very careful to, make a good example, because everything you do is going to reflect on everybody else of your kind. And I read that and I thought to myself, this just wasn't just advice for her leaving the camp or a real clear description of racially what the situation was. It was advice for raising their children. Because if they wanted to keep their kids safe, what they wanted was lay low, don't make a lot of waves, work really hard, um, and always remember that everything we do is going to reflect on other Japanese. And we grew up, people would often say, well, you were an intern. What do you know about it? I grew up soaked in all of their emotion.
Of course you did.
Right.
I mean, how could you not be?
Right. And they had been traumatized. They were traumatized. And I grew up with their fears, with their anxiety. You know, they didn't teach us English or they didn't teach us Japanese. So I could never talk to my grandparents. Um, and I really have spent a lot of time thinking about that. So it was a book about her stuff, but also really examining what this did, you know, the intergenerational messages, because the message is clear in that document. Helpful hints. You don't, you're different. And being Japanese is not fitting in here, you know? You're not really, the message to me was, you're not really American. People are going to see you as second class. You're not, there's something wrong with being Japanese. And
Uh,
50s were tough, man,
yeah, yeah. I was just gonna say it's a beautiful but heartbreaking story, and bless you for carrying that forward. And I have so many other questions I'd love to ask, but I know we have to stay on time and task here. I guess the three things I will bring up: one, I'm so sorry that your mom had Alzheimer's. I had that in the family, and it's a
Oh yeah,
horrific thing to have to suffer through. Um,
it's common.
More common than you would think, and more tragic than anyone that if you haven't experienced it, cross your fingers and hope that you ever have to experience it. But
Aaron, dying is hard.
dying is
Period.
hard. But
I mean, I'm just hoping for a quick heart attack,
me
But
too. Bring it
right,
on, because the drawn out, like forgetting things and forgetting your loved ones and all those,
having a
it
stroke,
sucks.
being
Yeah,
trapped in a body you can't control. Anyway,
that's it right there.
liver topic.
So
Okay.
the two other things are, one, this must be like an amazing way to like connect with your mom in a way that most people don't ever get a chance to connect with their parent and to see a whole different side. And I guess the third is, I feel like we know so little about the Japanese internment camps, because I was talking with someone about this, I think, and this is a gross generalization, but the Jewish people in general, and again, gross generalization, tend to be more storytellers and have talked a lot about the Holocaust, where I think the Japanese are a little more reserved and have sort of not told that story as widely and greatly.
Aaron didn't talk about it at all, you know, even with their children. Now it would come up, we were kind of, they would say before camp. Oh, remember that guy before camp? He was a real bleh. And hey, that guy, remember after camp? He did everything. Their life was divided. And you're just like a kid and you're going, oh, okay. Um, I didn't really learn the details of it until I was in high school in a
It's
book,
crazy if you think about it, right?
right? Right. So, it was not people go, well, it wasn't in our history books. Like, I'm Japanese. I didn't know the details of it. I mean, I knew things happened, but, I didn't really know the entirety of it. And these papers, I have my dad's papers too. He lost his drugstore. They both lost everything. They lost everything. But my dad was this young, ambitious young guy. He had just opened a second drugstore. He just bought a new cream colored Chevrolet coupe. Very excited about that. Lost all of it. And, the way they lost things was tragic, really.
It is tragic. Well, I want to carry some of that positive mojo from your dad, who I can already tell based on how it lights you up. He lights you up. Uh, while we focus on this, the show focuses on influential people doing societal good, and we do want to talk about a very important program that you're involved in called Students Rising Above. But first, I want to talk about the fact that you have this fierce commitment to water conservation, restorative agriculture and ecological restoration. Based on my research, I think this has a little bit to do with your dad's influence on you early days. So tell us more about where that passion came from and how you manifested that.
So he grew up in a little tiny segregated logging town called Mukilteo, Washington, because his dad was worked on it was a small Japanese camp of Japanese laborers. So he was a country boy, and he grew up fishing. He grew up, picking, foraging wild plants and picking berries. And I was his partner. I was his mushroom partner. Um, we would go blackberry picking in the summer. We had something all year round that we would pick mushrooms in the spring and in the fall. And there were we would pick watercress. We would dig clams. I wouldn't go fishing with him though. He was a fisherman, but I wouldn't, because he wouldn't come in, he would just go, one more minute. And then it would be like, I'm dying here. Um, so, but he brought me up with that closeness to the earth. And I saw what would happen. We had places that's our favorite blackberry place. And then all of a sudden there was a subdivision. Or that was our mushroom place. And all of a sudden it was being torn, all the trees were being torn down. And it really, I think I just had that, I had it in me. He led the way, but I think it was kind of genetically there too, that it resonated. So now, I volunteer doing environmental restoration. That's the main thing that I work on. And that's how I get my exercise. It's a really fancy way of saying I go out and I pull weeds, you know. I pull invasive plants and then we plant native plants. And a lot of our work has morphed into fuel reduction because the forests in California, the area around in the Oakland Hills is just cluttered. I mean, it's so overgrown. And that's what's fueling these, oh, don't get me started now. You see, Aaron, you're in trouble. Uh, that's what's fueling these mega fires, when they catch onto all of that undergrowth that we've allowed to grow, and then you have drought. It's an explosion. It doesn't work along an old-fashioned fire line anymore. It's an explosion, and the embers go out. They can go out for a mile and start a new fire there, and one there, and one over there, and they're everywhere. So that's what I do. I do it because it gives me a sense of purpose, but it also is where I find my peace. It's my sanctuary. I go out there, no one's around, and I can just,
Well, isn't it beautiful when those two things can coexist,
yeah,
right? You're doing good
my mind
and
goes,
you're doing good for yourself.
yeah, it's the only place where my mind goes quiet, really. Otherwise, the committee's going.
I know that,
Committee's
girl.
working, man. Aaron, the
Yeah,
committee is working here.
I get it. I get it. Well, not speaking of committees, but we do have a mutual friend and a gentleman named Stephen Parlett. And
All
Stephen
right.
Parlett had turned me on to this organization called Students Rising Above. As the organization's co-founder, can you tell us a little bit more about this program and why it's more important than ever right now?
Um, so when I was an anchor and I had some control over what I could. Well, it started in LA and I got to do a series of stories on these, they called it beating the odds. And it was working with the Children's Defense Fund. They picked out these kids who had um, figured out that education was going to be their only way out. They're all low income kids. Um, but they were extraordinary, right? I mean, uh, they were extraordinary kids, and we did these stories, and they were really popular. And so they asked me, "Can you keep doing them and do one a week?" And I said, "Are you kidding? I love this." And when I came back to the Bay Area, that was in Los Angeles. I was there for 6 years. When was able to come back to the Bay Area, the news director said, "What do you want to work on?" I said, "I want to do those stories." We changed the name because Children's Defense Fund had it copyrighted, but we would profile. I realized what I really wanted to do was to tell people what was happening to children who were growing up in poverty, you know, and no one wants to hear about. No one wanted to really hear about homelessness, or they don't want to hear about poverty, or that sounds cynical, but it's kind of true.
Yeah.
Because it's overwhelming. It's sad and it's overwhelming, you know? And, but what they will do is listen to the story of one child who's been able to rise above it, figure out a way to rise above it. So we started profiling these kids who were just amazing, right? They had most of them, you know, some of the first to graduate from high school, first in their family to graduate from high school, all of them the first in the family to finish, to go to, want to go to college. Um, but to even come up with the idea of college was a leap because there were no role models for a lot of them and no one was encouraging them to go to college. And these were kids at the time I started. Most of them were living below the federal poverty line. And most of them did not have a fully functional family, or they didn't even have necessarily, um, they weren't living in, you know, a two-parent home.
Right.
Most of them were not living in, or a lot of them not in a one, where they were living in one-parent home. A lot of them were either in foster care or they were basically on their own. Now, what do I mean by that? They had come up with all manner of living, you know, they were living with a grandmother, they were living with an aunt, they were living with some relative, but basically kind of, you know, kind of on their own. Some of them were literally on their own. 18-year-old kid was raising his 11-year-old daughter all by himself in East Oakland on his grandfather's Social Security. Another young woman and her sister raising their 14-year-old, in charge of their 14-year-old son, not son, brother, after their grandmother died. Parents were gone, left her with grandma. Then when grandma dies, when grandpa dies, you know, these kids were raising, a lot of these kids were raising siblings, a lot of siblings. So there was, you know, what was the commonality? How did they do this, you know? And I was talking to uh, a mentor of mine who was also working with these unusual low income kids who really wanted an education. And I said, what's the thing? And she said, you know, they have all decided there's another person in their life that's more important than them. I said, it's altruism. And that was where I really began to see this unusual character was in these 17-year-old kids. You know, so people go, oh, you must have interviewed some really, really important movie stars and important people in your life. Who impresses you the most? I go, some 17-year-old kids who had figured out a way to lift them and their family out of poverty. They were 17, 18-year-old kids who taught me and go, you know, how did you do this? How did you do this? Right? How is it that you are focusing on school when everything in your world is, I mean, these are kids who talked about going hungry, having no electricity, no water. One of them ended up joining the Peace Corps later after she graduated from college. And she was assigned to Africa, to sub-Saharan Africa, to Swaziland. And the kids, she would talk to the kids about, and here she is in their mud huts. They have no running water. They have no electricity. And she said, when I was growing up, I had no running water and I had no electricity. And they said, you're lying. You grew up in America. You had everything. And she said, I am not lying. This is my story. And I'm telling you my story. And that's how some of these children are living right now. And it's getting worse for them because a lot of their assistance is in the process of being defunded. You know, food stamps are what we used to call food stamps. Is is being cut back. There are new rules. Healthcare. Um, you know, when these kids needed a root canal, you know the pain that involves. They
Yeah.
couldn't go to school. So, you know, I met these extraordinary young kids. I'd say, how did you do it? And they'd go, I'd focus on the positive and I blanked out the negative. And I go, wow, I wish I could do that. you know?
It gives you perspective,
I
right? I mean, you think
was,
about our lives, and when things seem like they're bad, it's like, well, it could be a
oh,
lot worse, right?
yeah, I
Well,
focus
I do
positive.
want to ask an important question because this you've spelled out why it is so important. How do people learn more about your incredible causes and or connect with you?
Oh, I would so appreciate it if they would look up Students Rising Above. I mean, what happened was we would ask viewers to send in money to send these kids to college. And they started sending in money and they started volunteering. And it evolved into a nonprofit that is still running today. And it's now like 25 years old. And has a new CEO who I am so excited about. But it's studentsrisingabove.org. And, the goal is to send more kids to college, but they also help them find a career because what we're finding is, getting into college is, you can't just give them a scholarship and go, here, have a good life.
No, because there's a lot of other expenses that wrap around that.
Right. We were finding they were going to college. They didn't have, they go there their first day with a little backpack and just their stuff. And here the new roommate would come in with the parents and the big fluffy quilt and the sheets that were the right size. And I'm thinking of one specific young woman. She didn't have the sheets. It requires those special sheets, long
Yep.
sheets in a dorm. She had none of that. None of the bedding, no computer. They need all those things. They need the toiletries to be able to go down the hall to take a shower, you know.
You're just thinking how humiliating that must have been to show up thinking like, oh, I get to finally do this. And then it's like, except I don't have any of the things that I'm supposed to have because, you know, people
And
didn't
that,
think about that. They didn't look around the corners for that. So that's critically
right.
important.
And the ones who are homeless and, Thanksgiving comes and everyone's gone and they have nowhere to go or Christmas vacation. Yeah.
Well, thank
So,
you for being part of that. Thank you for telling those stories. And you've really inspired me. Steven's been talking to me, and I need to just
oh,
double down and
come
invest
in.
some time
Come
and
to
money and
our house,
energy there.
hon.
Yes, absolutely.
Really. We would welcome you with open arms. We'd be so grateful to send these amazing kids who are going to make such a difference in America. They
They
are making
are.
such a difference,
I, I can tell just listening to your stories about it. So thank
Yeah,
you for
my lawyer now was one of the first students I interviewed.
that is amazing.
Yeah.
Like talk about proof in the pudding.
And she could talk about not having water and not having electricity. She grew up with that
Yep.
and being hungry.
Well, I'm very appreciative that there are people like you in the world that are doing these things. And like I said, it just doubled my resolve to like get involved. And I encourage all of our listeners to consider getting involved. I do want to shift gears to a little bit lighter because we've just talked a lot about very important stuff, a little bit heavy stuff. And now this is the part where I like to get to know the guests in a little bit of a fun way. You actually semi answered one of my questions already, so I'm gonna we'll take that answer and then we'll push back a little bit. But I do like this one, which I just want to see how people take it. What is the dirtiest sounding word that isn't actually a dirty word? The example I give out to guests is spatchcock, but I'd love to hear what you have to say, Wendy.
Well, no, and I got to here's a confession is that, and I'll tell your audience that Aaron did have the courtesy of telling me he was going to ask me this beforehand, or I really would have been caught empty handed. And I had a hard time coming up with anything, but I would say bottom feeder.
I've had probably a dozen guests on already. I've had some really good answers. Bottom feeder has not come up, and I love that one, and I love that you played along with me on that one.
Oh, yeah. I
Okay,
look,
we we talked about this one already, and you actually gave the best answer because the question is, I'm sure you've had chances to meet famous people in your life as a news anchor, and having interviewed anyone and everyone, who's impressed you the most. So you've already mentioned who the person is, which are your kids, which the
yeah.
resolve that they have and their stick-to-itiveness and their positivity. But aside from all of those important people, let's single out someone that may have been an actor, a musician, or a politician that really impressed you.
No, I'll tell you about one of those 17-year-olds. So when Kimberly was 5, her mother was shot right in front of her. by her then husband, a stepfather. Kimberly never knew who her father was. And she and her two little brothers were placed with a grandmother who was an alcoholic and would beat them. Um, and, wake them up in the middle of the night and make them go down and clean the whole house. But she was really, the beating was getting really dangerous. And one day she came after her little brother, and these little brothers were like tiny, you know, 5 and 7, even not even that. I don't know. Anyway, coming after him with a frying pan and banging him up, and she could tell it was somebody was really going to get hurt. I mean, they were getting hurt, but it was going to get really bad. So in the middle of the night, after the grandmother had passed out, she took those two little brothers. She told them to pack everything they had in their little backpacks, and she took them. They caught a bus in the rain, in the dark, and she rescued them and took them to another relative's.
That's incredible. That is truly incredible.
That's my hero.
I, I can see why you're choosing that answer because that is a hero for sure.
To have that courage. I mean,
Oh. Like I said, if only, we could have half of that in our lives. And clearly you've done a lot more of this than I have. But I do want to ask you one more serious question and then a lighter question to wrap us up. And you've lived a very full life, but what's one regret that you've had in your life that you're willing to share with the audience?
I regret. When I was in high school. I went to a working class high school, very very diverse. Um, I didn't think about college at all. I didn't think about where I was going to apply or anything. My parents made me apply to a little school called Whitman, a private school, and then I applied at the University of Washington. Everybody went to the UW and in Seattle, or they went to Western, or we went to the state colleges, or but I did get into Whitman from the what do they call that when you're on the alternates list or something?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, you're waitlisted. Yeah,
I
which makes you feel like, guess what? You're second choice.
Well, I was second choice, but I did get in, and I went there for a year, and that was where I learned intellectual discipline. I mean, I went to a truly, I mean, our high school was so, I don't think I learned a thing in my senior year. Um, anyway, but I learned intellectual discipline because I had study hours. It was really strict, and at 7 o'clock, no one could talk on the phone. No one could have visitors. You sat in study hall and you studied for 3 hours straight every night. And my big regret was that I left there after a year and went to the UW, where I was like one of 500 kids in a auditorium listening to this professor. Never met the professor ever, you know, um, or in those kind of classrooms. You didn't meet the
Right,
professor. You
right,
met him,
right.
yeah, TA. Um, Later, I met some professors, but nothing like Whitman, where it was small classes and where they really challenged you and where I was forced to study. And I think it would have made a big difference because, basically, I went to a public school and a lower level, you know, they had an exchange program with our school and one of the schools that where all the kids came from educated families, and the kids came back to our school talking about it like they'd gone to a different country. That you wouldn't believe what they have at the school. It was like, you know it just it wasn't a college prep high school. It just wasn't. I wasn't in that mode. I didn't take accelerated classes. I wish I'd stayed one more year at uh, Whitman. I didn't because I knew it was hard on my parents. They didn't make any money, you know. Uh, but I think it would have made a difference in my life and therefore in theirs had I done that.
I say you turned out okay either way, but I hear you, and it's hard sometimes to do hard things. And you said the most important thing, which was you had the awareness that this was hard on your parents, and you were trying to give them some grace. And
Well, and I
so
also think, let me be real honest, I was afraid of failure there, and I couldn't
that's
allow,
fair.
could not allow failure because, you
That's
know,
not who you are. Yeah.
no, and being Japanese, just the pressure,
Also
the
an
pressure.
important piece. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I didn't want to, and that was a tough school, you know. Um, I was there long enough to figure that out.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's
thank
why I have that regret.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And I know that's not easy, but I appreciate you being vulnerable. And that's part of the goal here is to allow our guests to be vulnerable. And that gets us to our last question, which hopefully is a fun question, which is if you had any artist or band that you could have seen but didn't get a chance to, who would that be?
Aretha Franklin.
Rita Franklin. What a great choice. Perfect choice, actually.
Maybe the Temptations. Maybe the
Also
Temp.
an excellent choice.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Wendy, this has been a joy. Thank you so much for sharing yourself, these stories. Oh, I do want to know when's the book coming out because I am now
Yeah.
dying
Yeah,
to
listen,
like read the book.
my goal is before I die. I mean, I keep going down
That's
rabbit.
like 40, that's 40 more years. So we
Yeah,
need it
it's going to
before
be a
then.
little while. It's going to be a little while, but it will happen.
Okay.
I'm working on it. I'm really working
Okay.
on it. It's my life's goal.
Well, when Wendy comes out with a book and it's published, maybe we'll do a redux of this because I would love to be able to talk more about the
Oh,
specifics.
thank
And I
you.
want people to be able to find it and read it. And like I said, I'm fascinated based on everything you told us so far. So, Wendy, thank
Thank
you so much for taking the time today.
thank you. Thank you.